You are listening to the Small Town Big Talk Show, the weekly podcast for small town people with big dreams and ideas. I'm your host, Rebecca Undum, and each week we'll cover a topic meant to inspire, encourage, and empower you to live big in your small town. Although it has its challenges, nothing beats small town living, and we're committed to sharing the best of what's working in the communities we serve. So enjoy this episode, and we hope it helps you to bloom where you've been planted. My guest on today's episode is Adrian. I am so thrilled to be sharing this conversation with you that I got to have with her. She is a former middle school English teacher. She worked for Teach for America in Los Angeles and is originally from and has since relocated back to Mitchell, South Dakota. And she joins me today to tackle the incredibly challenging conversation about race in America. When the events surrounding George Floyd's death and the following protests and rioting all kicked off not far from home for me, I felt all sorts of things, which I think a lot of us do. And I went into my Facebook group, the Live Big in a Small Town Facebook group, and asked a few questions. One was just me admitting to the vulnerability and the uncomfortableness, the discomfort, I guess is the proper word, that accompanies some of these really challenging things. In rural America, not all of us, it depends on where you live, I understand that, but I am not confronted with racism on a daily basis in the sense that we don't have a widely diverse population. And so it led to all sorts of questions for me, like, what is my role in this? What can I do? What is my job as it relates to parenting? And I basically took that, and my Facebook group is a safe place for me to do so. And I asked some questions, and I asked if anybody would be willing to record this podcast episode. And Amber raised her hand. We had a conversation ahead of the call, and I knew that I could have this conversation with her. It is a nuanced, challenging, but so relevant conversation. And she gives us some practical things to think about. And it's honestly all delivered with a lot of love and grace, which is the only way I want to have this conversation. The fighting and the back and forth and the politicizing and the anger and the hate, that's going to be what it's going to be, but it doesn't have a place in my heart. It doesn't have a place in this platform. I do this podcast to bring hope and optimism for a brighter future for our small towns. And Amber was exactly the guest to have to tackle this topic and try to deliver it with that in mind. So seriously, friends, buckle in and enjoy this chat with my good friend, Amber. Also, I will say the show notes are chock full of resources and ideas that Amber has shared to help all of us grow in this area. So enjoy it, and let's all do our part, because this isn't an other group problem. Even out in rural America and small towns, we have work to do, friends. All right, Amber, welcome to the Small Town Big Talk Show.
Thank you.
I am so excited to visit with you, friend. This is unequivocally the most challenging topic we've ever tackled on the Small Town Big Talk Show. It's timely. And I first just want to really warmly welcome you to our show. And thank you for stepping forward. I went out into our Facebook group and I was like, hey, my heart hurts. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't feel like I have anybody I can ask. And you private messaged me and you were like, I think I have some relevant experience. So we're talking about race. We're talking about race relations. We're talking about that in the context of our small communities, what it means for us. And so again, seriously, thank you, first of all. And why don't you just jump in and tell us a bit about what made you say yep, I think I can engage in a conversation about this?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the warm welcome. This is my first podcast interview I've ever done. And apparently I'm just really jumping in here with,
you are, yep, jumping into the deep end. Yeah.
Yeah, really jumping in. So I hope that I can offer something of value. I think the reason that I messaged you is that I grew up in a rural area. I grew up in the Mitchell, South Dakota area, and went to college, the University of South Dakota, and then went to Los Angeles, and then went to the Twin Cities, and was the whole time doing racial justice work in education through Teach for America, and then through a charter school that I helped to start in St. Paul. And then we recently moved back to the small town where I'm from in Mitchell, and have been living here for a couple of years. So I think I have both the small town experience, and I have some experience doing work around race, both with, internally with myself and learning and working with students of color and families of color and communities of color. And I've learned some things, and I surely don't have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers about anything, but for sure about this topic, no one has all the answers. It's extremely complex. I think I have some things I can share.
You do. And so you and I, so everybody knows, you and I had a beautiful conversation. It was funny, right? Like, this is one of those big topics. And you and I didn't know each other. I mean, other than just you were in my close Facebook group. So we had a really rich conversation just the end of last week, kind of setting us up for this. And I have been thinking about you. And by the way, you just need to know, like, I had a great conversation with my husband about this whole topic over the weekend. And I kept calling you my friend Amber. Okay. Just like, because we're friends now. And I really do feel that way. Like, you can't talk about the stuff that we've been talking about and not get there pretty quickly. But I think one of the things that struck me so much about your story, and I would love if you dive a little bit into this. So when you left Mitchell, was going into social justice, was like that kind of work. Is that what you went into? Like, you went to college, what did you study? And then just even talk a little bit about the potential culture shock, which maybe is an unfair, it's kind of the blanket statement, like the cliche of culture shock. But Mitchell, South Dakota to Los Angeles, California is a pretty stark difference. So can you speak a little bit to that for the audience?
People have asked me, people have said that to me lots of times, like, were you just so, how was it going to Los Angeles? And I actually lived in Spain for 6 months before I went to LA. So I was studying in Vermilion, and then I spent my last semester abroad in Spain. And then I went basically right from Spain to Los Angeles. So it was kind of intense, but I really never experienced like a culture shock. I've just always been a very open-minded person, and a very kind of, I take things as they come. And I mean, my family is my dad's an independent thinker, and we were all raised with prejudice. Maybe we'll talk there, we'll talk about that later. But I was definitely raised to be very open-minded and just like curious. And so, I mean, it was a shock somewhat, but I don't know. I mean, everything's a shock. Like, going to USD was different than being in my class of 15 and Ethan and then going. So it was kind of just incremental. And I think your first job always is a shock when you're leaving college. I don't know. So I never really experienced it like that. I will say you had asked about what I majored in. I majored in English and Spanish. It was an English and Spanish double major. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do after school. And so I applied to this program, Teach for America, and I was accepted. And so that's how I got to go to Los Angeles. I got placed there. And so I wasn't off to necessarily do racial justice work, but I was interested in what they were doing. I had heard about the program. I thought it seemed like really meaningful work. My mom was a teacher, so I thought I could probably teach for at least a couple of years. I was an education major for a semester, but I didn't like it. I didn't like what I was doing at USD, so I dropped education. So I was just a straight English major. And then I would say too, just thinking about the culture shock, I didn't have a lot of time in Los Angeles to be shocked. It was like right into work. Like, I didn't have a lot of time to be like, oh, this is so different, because it's super intense. I don't know if you're super familiar with Teach for America, but it's a really intense program. Like, I got there, and then a little bit later, a couple weeks later, I was working in Watts, which I don't know if you're familiar with Watts. It's a very inner city Los Angeles, like Watts, Compton, like the inner city of Los Angeles, California. And Teach for America is a very robust program. I mean, so they had high expectations of us right away. You need to have high expectations for these kids. We did a lot of education around a lot of things, poverty, race, different things that are going to impact our work with these kids, right? And then I was in graduate school at the same time out there. And if you know any teachers, the first couple of years of teaching, regardless of where you're teaching, are so intense, full of so much learning. You're basically learning how to do the job while you're doing the job. So I had no time to think. I don't remember experiencing culture shock because I was just in it. And so I think that's another part of it too.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So when we were first kind of visiting, I should maybe share a bit with the audience about some of what I tried to articulate that I was feeling, because I would guess that some of how I said things is also kind of why you went I think I can talk about this. So I'm back in my very small town, practically zero diversity in terms of, people of color. We have very few shades of color in my community. And it was like, I take seriously the fact that it would be super convenient for me just to say, oh, that doesn't feel like my problem. Yeah. Because it's not in my face, right? Not only do I not really see it, I certainly don't experience it. So then I think it can be really easy to just kind of conveniently take the road of, well, I don't think I have to do anything. But I'm raising 3 children. I take very seriously the fact that my job is to equip them and to help them understand the things that are difficult to understand without a lot of experience to it. And then the other thing is that as a genuine champion for small towns, I'm thinking about like, what does that mean for our communities? And what's our responsibility as communities to educate ourselves, to learn more, to better understand. And you and I'm so excited to hear. I know you've got a lot of stories to share with things that you saw, things that you experienced. And at the end of this, like our goal is to say, okay, audience, here are some ideas for things we can do. Not to say like, follow us, because like you said, like nobody has all the answers, because this is a really deep and long storied problem. But do you want to share some of what you saw, some of the things that really stood out to you? And then we'll just kind of see where we go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of like I said, there was a lot. Teach for America does a really good job, at least they did when I was in it, teaching very intentionally about history. And for example, I remember when I learned about how schools are funded through property taxes and all of that. And actually a big part of Teach for America's mission is getting people into the classroom. So Teach for America is really criticized for all these people that come in and they teach for 2 years and then they're out of the communities. But what I always try to say to that is actually a big part of their mission is to not only be working to have high expectations and to really get some achievement with the kids that they're working with and really, get involved in the schools and the communities, but to take, if they're not going to stay in education, which a lot of them don't. I did for a little while, but a lot of people, it's kind of like a prestigious organization. So a lot of people will say, oh, this is just for your resume. You can be like, oh, I worked with the poor kids for 2 years and it's a hard organization to get into. And then you can just put it on your resume. But a big part of the mission is so that you can get into the classroom and into these communities and into the lives of people and have this like on the ground experience with these communities and with what these schools look like. And then you can take that awareness into the future, into whatever profession you're going to go into the rest of your life, so that it's not theoretical, so that you're really in it. You're in these communities, you're in these schools for 2 years. And that I think is really powerful because I remember learning about how schools are funded and then just seeing the disparities up close, seeing these schools that so many kids of color attend and how different they are from like the schools in the nice parts of Los Angeles.
Or the school you went to school in?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean, seriously.
100%. 100%. And so seeing that with my own eyes was really, really powerful. And then I was thinking, this is something I just thought of this morning when I was thinking of our conversation. And this is weird because I'm married with kids now, but I actually dated a guy when I was in Los Angeles who was Latino and who had grown up in East LA and also had done New York City Teaching Fellows, which is a similar program to Teach for America. And so he had taught in the Bronx. And I really learned a lot from him, like through my relationship with him. He would tell me obviously about his experiences. He was a more experienced teacher than I was. I was in my first, couple years of teaching. So he would tell me about things he saw working with kids in the Bronx. And then he would also tell me about things that he experienced growing up in East LA as a Latino kid. That was really helpful. Like being in that relationship. And he was a really thoughtful guy and just like listening to him talk. That was part of my education too. That was really helpful. I was like, oh my gosh, it just opened my eyes to tons of realities that I had no idea about.
So I want to see if you can provide a little more context around the disparity and this is just one disparity, but I think since we're talking about it, like what role does redlining, what is it? If you can, not to make you be carry the brunt of full-on education here at all, but it was crazy. Just over the weekend, somebody posted a video again on Facebook, right? Which is where a lot of good stuff is being shared and really difficult things are being shared right now. It's not exactly a friendly place to hang out, but we
can talk about that later.
Oh gosh, for sure. Right. They shared a video that just really quickly, like within 3 minutes, and you know what? Speaking of that, I'm going to link to it in the show notes. So if people want to watch it, they can, because I did save it. Real quick, easy, truly easy to understand explanation of the history of oppression that starts with redlining and then what that means. So like if you are only allowed to live in poor neighborhoods and then you plunk a school in the middle of that poor neighborhood, it's funded by low property taxes. Yep. And so I don't know that the average person spends a lot of time thinking about that. It's really easy to stay removed from it if you either don't have children. You don't see that connection, right, between your property tax dollars and school funding. So can you explain a little bit about especially redlining? Because I think that again becomes a historical context where the advantages were not there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, and honestly, it's been a while since I've thought about some of these things. I'm sad to say, because that's part of white privilege, right? To be able to step away from realities of race and things. And
can we just highlight that?
Yeah.
You said this to me in our first conversation. You said, and you didn't say it as part of white privilege, but I think this is why we're having this conversation, Amber, is that immediately when people say white privilege, as a white person, there is an immediate, truly, and this, I'm not ashamed to admit it, because I think more of us need to be able to say out loud what we feel about stuff. Yeah. But I immediately get that, like, that doesn't feel quite right. Mm-hmm. You know, that doesn't feel valid. Like, I'm not racist, right? Right away we go to like the defensive side of it. But white privilege, the idea of white privilege simply means that, and you had said, and I'm going to paraphrase you and then please say more. But you had said, there's two things you said that really stuck out to me. One was, it's not that you've never had troubles. It's that you've never had troubles because of the color of your skin. Like, you don't also have that. You might have grown up poor. You might have grown up in an abusive family. Like, those are legitimate problems. But it's not also, then you have racial discrimination to deal with on top of that. Second thing you had said was, part of white privilege is being able to say, oh, like, when it works for me, my schedule, my life, I can dive in and care deeply about these things. Mm-hmm. Like, you specifically said this about yourself, right? Like, you were immersed in it. Mm-hmm. And you said, and then I can put it away. Like, put it on a shelf, and it's something that I don't have to interact with. So I think that is such an important point. Can you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just expound on that a little bit.
So many things. Yeah. So I remember being when we were still living in Minnesota after I had just had my first baby. So this wasn't very long ago. And Philando Castile was killed. I don't know if you remember that one. That was real close to my heart, because I had a baby who was just like a week old. And I used to work in St. Paul. That's where the charter school was that I started. And I remember a neighbor of mine had just kind of like a prayer and kind of song and sharing kind of time for friends from church and people to come and just sit with the pain of that and sit with the pain of racism. And it was just this beautiful thing. And I remember when it was my turn, or I guess I chose to share, I remember just bursting into tears and saying, like, I used to do this work. I used to be in there and doing this work around racial justice. And then I was a stay-at-home mom. I was home with my baby, and I just felt this incredible guilt, because I just kind of realized in that moment, I was in it for a while, but then I went on with my life and I could just set it aside, because because it doesn't impact me daily. I can carry on like that racial issues don't exist, because it doesn't impact me, because I have white skin, And so that is so real. And I think that's such an important realization for white people. And that defensiveness you talked about is so real too, because life is hard. Life is so hard. Everyone has struggles. And so I think that's part of the defensiveness, is like, my mom's family grew up and they did not have money, and they worked really hard. And I've seen that defensiveness. I didn't use anything as an excuse. And it's just like, it's just not the same. It's just not the same weight. When you really learn about some history, like redlining, for example, it's not the same weight. So let's talk about redlining. So redlining has to do with, and again, I'm not an expert. If you've read about it recently, perhaps you can correct me or add to what I'm saying. But it was this practice that happened around economic development, where certain neighborhoods were singled out. I think they call it redlining because perhaps they used a red pen or something, or maybe they used, I don't know why exactly. And they then would use that to deny loans to people who wanted to buy homes, who had certain addresses that were within these redlined areas of a city. And so it has to do with like the development of wealth in a family. If you were denied a loan to be able to buy a home, that's kind of how you start to go up the ladder and make a life for yourself. So it just kind of, it has a legacy of, I think, not having wealth in your family, not having opportunities. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, the name of this movie is escaping me right now. I'll find it and I'll link it in the show notes. I was talking to my husband this weekend after you and I had visited, and he recalled that we watched this movie where it's the true story of two African-American men that created, I think it was just an LLC, or they created an incorporation, and they had a white guy be the face of their company because it involved buying real estate. It's historical in nature. I cannot think of what it's called. A super fascinating movie. And it's exactly what we're talking about.
Yep.
He was buying it so African-American people he could rent to them. Or I think he actually turned around and maybe sold them to them. Yeah, I'm not even sure if that was exactly, but it's just the idea that those two gentlemen couldn't walk into a bank and get treated the same. So they had a white guy kind of be the face of their company. And
that's fascinating.
It is. Yeah. It's a really good, Samuel L. Jackson's in it too. So, he's fun.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think that it's this idea that, and I've heard people say that, like, when are they going to get over it? And it's so hard to just be like, and I get that, like, today's generation maybe never were owned by white people. Okay. Like slavery. I get that. But there's also just the significance of what that means. And I don't know why they ever would let it go. Not to say that it's an excuse, right? But I don't know.
I think a really important distinction to make here, and we talked about this in our conversation.
Yeah.
I think people who say things like that don't understand the systemic nature of racism. They think of racism as individual acts by people who hold prejudice. And that's why there's that reaction of, I'm not racist.
Right.
Because there's a systemic nature to it where it's kind of the water we swim in. It's in our institutions. Redlining is a great example of how it's in our history, in our institutions, even in our socialization of how Black people and other people of color are portrayed in the media, how, little things then we internalize as kids. And then we're making policies and then we're interacting. I think that's just a huge, huge understanding that if you shift your idea of racism from individual people committing acts of prejudice to this idea that racism is a systemic reality. It's a historical reality. It's a current reality that comes from the legacy of everything that has happened. And once you start learning about some of this stuff, you get it. But we don't learn about this stuff. We don't learn. And that's something I want to talk about later. Maybe if you don't know, you don't know. If you don't understand some of this stuff, you don't understand how systemic it is.
Right. So it's interesting though, is like, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about this idea that like we meaning all white people, which isn't fair, but I think people expect that at some point you let it go, right? Like that African-American people should let it go that slavery was a thing. Well, it's really hard to do that when there's residual effects of the people that oppress them still as well. Like, it's not just the awareness of the fact that your culture used to be owned by other people. Like, there's that, but then there's also, it's the residual effects of it. Like, there are still people walking around that hate people of color because of their skin. So why should they let it go, I guess is what I'm saying. Like,
yeah,
it's hard. And I know that that's hard. And like you said, I think that's such an important distinction. We're not talking about micro level aggression, like, which exists. And I think all of us, if we're honest, we can say we know people that are racist. I'm going to tell you my story here, what I experienced for the weekend soon. And I was just shocked.
When you say people that are racist, you mean people that are overtly racist?
Yes, overt racism. Like, they actually believe that there's,
Black people are inferior, for example. Like, that's
right.
a belief they hold.
That's a belief they hold. Or just the way they speak, the language that they use is implicitly racist because it's explicitly racist.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're saying.
No, yeah. Like, they're using words that label people of color in a negative way, right? So it's overt.
Or have a harmful history. Have a very hurtful history behind them.
Right. It's obvious. But I don't know that we're so good at realizing how, and the word systemic, I think, is hard for people to grasp, but it simply means that it's ingrained in our systems.
It's in our systems. Exactly. It's in our systems, whether we're talking about our actual systems, like in government,
Right.
or whether we're talking about just how we're socialized, like our cultural systems.
Right.
And how, and what we see and what we think of. I love this story. You should tell the story about that conversation you had about blackface and about dressing up as a,
yeah.
I mean, that is something I think that's important. It's just, you don't know what you don't know.
I can absolutely share it. So a person in my life asked me the question, why is it inappropriate for, if I respect, revere, and appreciate a person of color, and let's say we get to Halloween, right? And it's like, I want to be that person for Halloween. Why is it inappropriate for me as a white person to wear, and again, they didn't use the phrase blackface, because that's not, that again, wasn't even something they'd ever heard. Yeah, it was more just why are we not able as white people to take on the appearance of a Black person for Halloween? And I literally said to this person, I honestly don't know the answer. Because, like at the same token, you had the Wayans brothers that did White Chicks, that whole thing. It was a whole movie. Again, not knowing if that's appropriate or not, I guess. It was just the question of like, but what if that's my intention? It's like, I actually, not making fun of the person or anything. And then I asked you that because I was like, I feel like you can hold this with me, Yeah. Because again, like if we can't ask questions, Amber, if we can't talk this out and say, this is something I don't understand, and say it in a safe place where someone's going to care enough to like help us learn or tell us how to learn about it. Or again, there's Google, which Google can teach you a lot. But that's part of the learning and the growth that we all have to somehow make room to happen. And that's even challenging right now, I think.
Yes.
I don't feel like we're going to be welcomed necessarily to like ask all the questions. So there's a challenge with that too. But do you want to share the answer you shared with me? And then you shared a great article that I did read over the weekend.
Yeah. This is such a good one. So thinking about, we hadn't talked about that movie that you just mentioned. But immediately when you said that, I just thought, but there's no painful history of people of color, Black people dressing up as white people.
Exactly.
Here, there is a painful history. There's a history rooted in racism where people who were white dressed up as Black people. They were called minstrel shows. And they happened when we were talking, I couldn't remember for sure when kind of the height of the minstrel show was, but it was actually before the Civil War.
Right.
And kind of this idea of dressing up and promoting these effectively stereotypes about Black people, that they're, lazy and they're kind of silly and they're dumb and they were this kind of like entertainment for white people. And it helped to promote this idea that Black people were inferior. Right. And so it was so related to the roots of racism in our country. And so the reason that it's not okay to do is because it's painful to think about, because it feels like that. It's not that. Of course, it's not that, but it feels like that because that's what people used to do. A white person painting their skin with dark makeup. That's what they used to do in minstrel shows. So there's pain there. There's pain in that. And that's why it's not okay to do. That's why, not even that it's not okay, it's not kind. It's not thoughtful to do because there's pain, because Black people experience pain when they see that. So it's not okay for that reason.
Right. Well, and that's just it. You kind of just want to say, well, so here are the facts. I guess you choose for yourself if it's okay or not. But do you want to take on something, doing something that intentionally brings about pain for other people?
And I think if people know the history, I think so much of this is just pure ignorance. If they knew, like most people that I know, if they really knew and understood that history, there's no way they would do it. There's no way to do it. But when they just get told that's not okay to do, and they don't get any education, then they want to be different and be like, well, that doesn't make sense. So you need to get over it, right? That's when you need to get, or something that defensive energy comes in. But if they really knew the pain there and the history and how that really contributed to these ideas that these people were inferior. They weren't the same.
Well, what they are is mockable. That's what that was. They mocked them. Yes. I mean, you go back and right? Like you're something to be mocked, worthy of being mocked, which absolutely suggests that we would think you're inferior.
Yes.
And I think again, like that is exactly what this is. The lack of education and the lack of care on both sides of the conversation. of just to say, I can't be, well, you can. Everybody can feel and do whatever they want to do. But being mad at even white people for asking a question like that, that's rooted truly in not knowing and wanting to understand it better, is then to, like you said, to come back and just say, you can't do it with nothing else, no other support to help them understand. It doesn't build bridges, right? It just keeps us each on our side of the...
It doesn't build bridges, and it doesn't help people understand real history that's important. Right. It doesn't help people understand racism, frankly.
Right.
Yeah, there was another story too. Maybe I could share that. The one about, my teacher, that teacher that got fired. Do you want me to share that story?
Yes, please.
So there's another story too that I think is relevant here that happened in a school in New York City. A friend of mine, a writer friend of mine, one of her children attends. There was a teacher there who, as I believe a middle school teacher, and I used to be a middle school teacher, so I especially felt like a kindred with this story. She was, I think, we're studying slavery, and they were, with middle schoolers, you have to really engage them, and so you do a lot of dramatization if you're a good, middle school language arts history teacher. So reenacting things and things like that. And this teacher chose to reenact, I believe it was a slave auction, an auction of enslaved people, and apparently chose. I don't know if she chose. I don't know. I don't want to say what.
Yeah. You don't want to make it more inflammatory than it actually was, right?
Know.
Yeah. Totally.
Somehow had Black students playing the enslaved people in the auction, and which obviously was a terrible choice and not okay. But this idea that everything that happened is like a media storm, and the teacher was fired. Yeah. And there were even some, I remember my friend saying there were some Black parents who were saying, let's like slow this down, let's have a little like education here. But instead, like the culture, it's like, nope, canceled, like you're done. So she lost her job. And I can't imagine, what an opportunity that could have been for education, for everyone involved, for the teacher especially, to, of why that's not okay, and the pain there and the trauma there and what really happened. But instead it's just, you're done. Moving on. And I hate that.
I know. I hate it too. And when you told me this story, I remember just thinking, what a missed opportunity. Yeah. So totally. Let's say it was, half Black kids and half white kids. I don't know, whatever. But
yeah, I don't know either.
What did the white children learn from that? Just like if they didn't even understand what she had done that was wrong, or or that could be construed as hurtful or painful, they didn't get to learn it. Their parents didn't get to learn it.
No.
And I like we said, like, can you imagine how it would have been if instead they had done one big group, they had called all the parents together.
Oh, yes.
And all of the teachers. So
beautiful.
All of the teachers and the whole school system to come in. And and what we talked about is that'd be super uncomfortable for her. She'd have to sit through that.
But I guarantee you, she was trying her best to probably, I could even imagine she was really trying to show how horrible it was. I mean, this is guessing, right?
Totally,
but right. So even with really good intentions, though, you made a really bad mistake, but there has to be like forgiveness and conversation and education. And there's just so little space for that right now in our culture. And I think that ironically is really not helping promote anti-racism. It's promoting division, and it's so, we could talk about this.
Oh my gosh. Well, cancel culture in and of itself is a relatively new phenomenon, and it's just terrifying for people. I mean, and like you said, so you just said there's very little space. I would argue there's less than that. Like, I don't know what is a little bit more than zero, but less than almost none. I mean, it's crazy, right? Like, you just can't. And like you said, it's like, so what's the point of all of this? And I think that's a good place for us to start. For those of us that care, like I truly care, but I know how ignorant I am. I actually know it. Because I know where I grew up, I know what I've experienced, and my understanding outside of what I'm seeking, like in terms of education, is limited by my experience. And that's the case for all of us, unless we intentionally set out to try and learn, which is what I'm doing. Even by having this conversation, right? It's to open up the doors about it. But we're in this place where it's like intentions don't even matter anymore. If I don't like what you say about something, then you're wrong.
Let me challenge you on something just a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm not sure that our intentions should matter, because when people
that's fair. Yeah.
Pain, I don't know if our intentions matter. That doesn't disregard the point that there needs to be space for education and space for conversation. And that's what's really lacking.
And I appreciate what you're saying. I will always believe that intentions do matter. Your good intentions can't be used as a way to excuse pain that you might have caused somebody else. I know what you're saying. I mean, I know because you and I talked about that before, that like, so this person I was talking to that wanted to know why they couldn't dress up as a Black person for Halloween, right? If they were to do that, being completely ignorant of the ramifications, and somebody that they knew was hurt by that, it doesn't matter that her intentions were to not hurt that person, right? That the pain still exists. And I get that. I think it's back to that. There isn't any space to allow for people to not know, not knowing.
Exactly. No,
we're just not allowed to live there. And it's like, well, dang it. What about wanting to be better? That doesn't matter, because I think it should. And I think it has to. Otherwise, we're always going to be so divided on these issues. Like you said, we're never going to actually make anything change for the better.
I agree with that, what you just said. I just think the intention thing, that's a common response I've learned, right? Well, I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah. And I don't mean to use it as an excuse, like a get out of jail free card for hurting somebody, because I totally get that.
For sure. I think this gets at the systemic thing again, right?
Right.
Like, you might not have meant that. You might not be an overtly racist person, but you are touching on some history, some pain that you don't realize.
Yeah.
So while your intentions might be pure and fine, that doesn't mean they're not racist. That doesn't mean they're not, and by racist, I mean rooted in systemic racism. Does that make sense?
It totally does.
So I think,
it is. This is one of those things that when it just, like, let's take ourselves out of even this conversation about race. It's anytime we do something that brings about hurt in another person. It is not an apology for me to hurt you and then look at you and say, well, I'm sorry that you were hurt by that.
Mm-hmm.
No,
not really an apology.
Right. You can look at the person and say, I am so sorry that I hurt you. Even if you say, I truly didn't mean to hurt you. Help me understand. That's a bigger conversation. And I think, again, like we could apply that to so many situations, because what we want to do is we want to minimize the pain of other people if we don't believe we would respond that way to the same trigger. Well, hello, that's humanity. We don't respond the same to the same triggers because we all have different backgrounds. And this whole thing with race is specific, that they have a ton of historical context for these things to create pain. And we are ignorant to it because we don't have to live it.
Because we don't have to live it, and because our education system doesn't do a good job of telling some of our real history.
Right. Yeah. What other stories do you have to share of things that you experienced?
I was thinking about my time in St. Paul, I was a founding teacher at this charter school in a really nice part of St. Paul, right across from McAllister College on Summit Avenue. It was an all-girls middle school with social justice, racial justice, gender justice, really a big part of what we were trying to do, bringing together girls from all over the Twin Cities, from North Minneapolis, from in that really nice area of St. Paul, from over on, other parts of St. Paul, truly diverse in everything except gender. So it was all girls, but it was racially diverse, socioeconomically diverse. And it was just, it was such an amazing experience. What the school was trying to do was so groundbreaking and beautiful. There's so many things, but I thought of a couple different stories that stand out that I think maybe are relevant. There's one really funny one that I thought of. So we did one year this poetry unit, and it just stands out as like one of the most successful couple of months of my teaching career. It just was so unitive. The kids were just able to engage and just go so deep on so many things. It was amazing. We were reading this book of poetry where so it would have like little snippets of these fictional characters and kind of what they were going through in their lives. And then there would be a poem written by them afterwards. I think it's called Bronx Masquerade. Such an amazing book. And so we were reading, one of the little descriptions. It was a male character talking, and he used the word moms, talking about his mom. I remember when we were discussing, after we got done reading the description, a white girl was saying, okay, so like one thing I noticed is that this character has two moms. And I kind of like got a little bit tense because that's not what it was. That's not at all what it meant. He was saying moms, like in, I'm not going to call it slang, but in the way that people of color speak. Sometimes Black people speak. He was saying my moms. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I can't really say it because it's not a thing that I say. But this white girl was like, well, I noticed that he has two moms. And I felt a little tense looking around, and I saw like some of the Black girls look at each other, and they were like, you know, and it was like this weird moment. And then one of the Black girls was like, yeah, no, like he doesn't have two moms. He's saying my moms. That's something that just means, it's just another way to say my mom. And like, it was just this moment of, and I like I said, I felt tense because it was like definitely something where a white girl was not understanding something that was real clear to the Black girls in the room.
Right.
But it was this, we had created like a culture of trust, you know, in the classroom. And it ended up being this beautiful moment where like most of the Black girls were laughing. And then the white girl who had said this was like, oh my gosh, okay, I didn't know that. I had no idea. You know, so it's just like this beautiful little moment that stands out in my mind where there was this like understanding across Black and white that was just it was just so powerful. And then we just moved on, and we just had, there's so many things in that unit where there's just like a lot of connection around different things. But
that's such a powerful story.
Yeah.
Because it's like, where is that happening now? I mean, I'm sure there are places that it's happening. Okay. I don't want to be so doom and gloom, but there are places that that's not happening. And that's part of what I know when we get to like, what can we actually do about this? You know, about this, like that's air quotes, like good grief. It's a huge thing. But I think what, you know, I came to my Facebook group saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I want to be better. And I want to use what I do have, which this podcast is one of these things.
Yeah.
To help create a place where we can talk about this in the context of small communities, do it safely. And this idea of a culture of trust is something I can get behind. So I'm sure, again, like I'm sure this is happening other places, but I don't see a lot of that right now. And what a beautiful thing. And I think like for me, without population of people of color in my community, there's that back and forth isn't happening naturally because we just don't have the population to make that happen. So,
I mean,
but what a cool story. And I love that, like, they're giggling. And the girl that said she didn't get defensive. She just went, oh, shoot. Like,
she laughed. I remember she laughed too. You're right. She was like, she was a little embarrassed, but she was able to laugh. And we were able, it was just such a poignant moment. Like, you know,
if we could all sit with our embarrassment when we screw up, can you imagine how different the world would look?
Yeah.
Just that alone. Like if you could just go, ooh, that I feel silly. Like I feel dumb. Instead of defensiveness being the reaction, but just like a humility about it. Like, oh, kind of screwed that up. Okay. Beautiful story. I love it.
Thanks. It just really stands out. It's one of my strongest memories. And there were so many moments, but that's just one that really stood out. Another one that really stands out is one of my high achieving white students. She didn't come from a wealthy family. So middle class, maybe lower middle class, but just like one of my highest achieving students wanted to meet with me after school one day and brought her mom along. And I'm super thoughtful kid. And she was really pushing back on this idea that we didn't track at all. So we had all the students took language arts and social studies. I co-taught with a history teacher. I'm not sure if I said that yet. So it was an interdisciplinary humanities class. So I was the English teacher, the social studies teacher, and we didn't have like the advanced class, you know, like the gifted and talented track. And then it was like everybody. And it truly, I mean, the achievement and where kids were at and what they were able to do academically was like the range. Like the full range. And it was challenging, but part of the model was there were two of us. So we were supposed to differentiate the curriculum and do different things. And we tried really hard to do that. But this student was just like, I just feel like I'm not being challenged. I don't understand why we don't do this. You know, I don't understand why we can't. And I just had such a good conversation with her and explained to her some things around when schools have this gifted and talented track that you get on AP, it ends up looking pretty white because of who's picking those kids and how those kids act in school. And so we're trying to not do that. And we're also valuing academic achievement isn't the only thing that matters in the world. You are learning to be around people who are different from you, who've grown up completely differently than you, who've had different struggles. That's legit. Like that is something that's valuable. And so we just had this amazing conversation. And to this day, she is just I haven't been in touch with her for a little while, but sometimes she'll send me a text message, and she's just one of the coolest, smartest kids. I think she's going to be an engineer, which would make the school proud because part of it was focused on like STEM,
Sure,
and
right.
But just to have that conversation to help her understand why we weren't taking the high achieving kids and putting them in one last class, when we called it last, is language arts and social studies, and then having like the lower achieving, because it would look white and black. Not completely, but
yep.
We just had such a good conversation, and her mom was just super supportive and open. Her mom didn't come in. She just wanted to, I remember her saying, I just want to make sure that she's heard. And we just had this beautiful conversation around why we don't track basically in the school. And I'm not sure, that there's a ton that we can learn there, but just I think the ability to sit down and talk about some of these realities, like what gifted and talented looks like when you do that. What are the problems there with access and with just different things, right? And once you get put on a track, right, then teachers expect certain things of you, right? And so that then it contributes to a lack of opportunity and a lack of, it's a whole thing, right? And just to be able to have that conversation with her, and she was taking it in. And I'm not sure if she agreed at the end of the meeting, but she definitely, like to this day, she's just one of the best thinkers. She's just such a cool kid. And I remember that was a big conversation that we had after school that day.
And how old was she at the time?
He was either 7th or 8th grader. We taught 7th and 8th.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in listening to you, it's like asking the question, where and how can we create conversations like that in our lives? I mean, that's really what this comes down to, is like how, when you live in a place that maybe daily isn't offering up opportunities for it due to a number of factors, perhaps, what and how do we do that? Yeah. So I would love to hear what you've got. I know you've got a few ideas for us in small communities, like what can and what does this look like? Before we get to that, Amber, if you're willing to share some of the thoughts that you might have about why does it feel so easy for small communities, or what is the resistance or hesitance maybe on the part of people in small communities in particular to step into this conversation?
Yeah.
And know, okay, and you and I have talked about this, like this is not in any way meant to be a political conversation, okay? Because it doesn't have to be. Right now, and we talked about this, we're in an election year, so everything is political, unfortunately. But trying to keep that out of it, just understanding ourselves better as small town or rural people. What do you think are some of the reasons maybe that we're not inviting this kind of conversation or dialogue in our lives?
I mean, I think that's a big part of it, to be honest. At least from what I've seen, it seems to me like there's a hesitation to consider anything around race because it feels like that feels very aligned with the Democrat Party, to be honest, if we're people, right? And because race has been so politicized and the left, I mean, we're not going to go there, but the left has really become intense. I mean, that's just a fact. They've really become intense around some different things. And so I think that people who are politically conservative, right, they feel like that's going to the dark side for them to, have any sort of openness around racism, around race, around whiteness. And so I think that's a challenge. And I don't know, I think that's just the culture that we're in right now. Not to mention what you mentioned before, which is kind of this cancel culture and this like getting pounced on social media. I feel super lucky that I was able to do most of my work before social media was really a big thing. I mean, I did most of my work like in relationships with people, working in communities, in relationships with students, parents, colleagues, and now social media is so pervasive that it feels scary because social media, frankly, isn't the place for some, in my opinion. And so I think those are some big challenges, and I'm not sure that we can solve them, but
I only wanted us to touch on that for the very reason that I live in a very small town. There's going to be people in my community that listen to this conversation, or at least I hope they do. If any of them are feeling that pull to want to do something, and yet they have that weird fear and they're not even sure where it's coming from, I just want them to know that this is something that other people see. That perhaps it is that fear that it's aligning yourself with a group of people that you generally don't share a lot of beliefs with, or just viewpoints with, right? But there again, it's just like, how did race become something that belongs to one party? I don't know how that happened, but it did.
Well, it happens on the right too. I mean,
it
the
does.
right use that with abortion. I mean,
Yep.
You know, has really like, oh, if you're pro-life, you have to be a Republican. I mean, everything is politicized. That's what they do.
Yes,
for power,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And that's too bad because I feel like that's part of what limits conversation and education.
I know that it does because I think what it feels like, and I said to you, I sometimes feel like I don't know where I belong.
Yep.
It's like, I don't want to just be, I'm not binary like that. Like in terms of my thought process or political party. I do think that's something. We don't have to talk anymore about it, but cancel culture is something that if you've seen it at work in the lives of somebody, the life of somebody you know, or you've even just seen it occur. And well, like just recently, wasn't it? They called for Jimmy Fallon's cancel. Like they wanted to cancel Jimmy Fallon.
I think I did hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just those things where you're just like, okay, what does that even mean? And what do we do about it? But luckily for us, one of our ideas for small town people is not to take to social media. So that's not what we're going to suggest people do. So instead of getting on social media and trying to, I don't know, advocate for anything really on social media, what instead can and should we maybe think about doing?
Yeah, I just really think that social media is not the place for this work. I mean, for most people. Some people have made a business, right? And their whole thing is educating people around some of this stuff. And I'm not speaking to them.
Right.
But I think for the average person, it's not the place to do this work. I think the place to do the work is in your own mind and in your own heart to consider what prejudices you have, because we all have them, to learn some history that you don't know. So it's really personal work. It's really personal reflective work, which doesn't happen on social media. I think that's a big part of it. That it's internal work that happens with you and yourself.
Right. Well, and if you dive into the history and you choose to educate yourself by, and I know you've got maybe some suggestions for what that can look like, but outside of the rhetoric, the external stuff that's going to come into you, if you shut that off and you do the work, you're going to be confronted with feelings and thoughts about what you're reading. And there's going to be this, no matter what, when we're confronted with stuff, again, take it out of the context of race and just learning about that. It can feel really uncomfortable to sit with those feelings of just like complicity. If you feel like that's something that comes up for you, it's hard. The work is hard work.
It is hard.
And yet it's not harder than having to fight it every day when you didn't choose for it, choose it. Like specifically choose it, like, so we have to just acknowledge that it's not harder than.
Exactly. Listen, I had a situation not very long ago, to be honest, where I was in a group of writer friends. I'm a writer, and we were talking politics during COVID-19, which was probably a bad idea in the first place. But I was going back and forth. There were a few of us who had pretty strong opinions, and I was going back and forth with my writer friend who's Black. There was a moment where she got really upset with me for the way that I said something. And she said, this is something that happens whenever Black women talk with white women. There's a defensiveness. There's I'm going to disengage now because you're talking to me in a certain way. And it was really painful. It was really painful. And frankly, I'm still working through it. But instead of getting defensive, I apologized. I said, this is what was in my brain when I said that, but I hear you. And I'm reading a book that she recommended called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race. It's apparently like sold out everywhere on Amazon and everything because so many people are reading it. Yeah. And that's come recommended to me by other people too. And so even though I've done a lot of this work, I still could have messed up. I still caused pain to a Black woman. And I'm going to sit with that. And I'm very tempted to be defensive. But I just think when someone says that they're in pain, another human being, not a politician, says like, that hurts me. And that hurts me. Like, we'd be well served. We'd be well served to listen to them. We'd be well served to listen, right? And to not get defensive, right? And it is hard. So hard. And so, but I'm reading through this book, and honestly, if it's only been like a chapter at a time, but it's really good. It affirms a lot of stuff that I know, and it's challenging me a little bit too. And it is painful. It doesn't feel good, let me tell you. But like you said, it also doesn't feel good to experience racism on a regular basis. And so you have to have that perspective. Like, you just have to have that perspective that this is hard and I need to think about this, because some people don't have a choice of whether or not to think about this because they experience it regularly.
Right. Well, and I think that you sharing that story, it's so beautiful because it goes back to what we talked about with the whole thing with intentions. I think intentions matter from a standpoint of choosing to say, I want to get better at this. That's the intentions that I think matter. But when it comes to creating pain in other people, it doesn't matter if we intended to or not. It's about acknowledging that I don't get to judge somebody else's pain as warranted, justified, or not, because I am not in their shoes. They are in their shoes. And that's just such a good rule of thumb for just all interpersonal communications anyway. But I don't know why it seems like collectively we can accept that in so many contexts. This one doesn't seem to be like one that we can easily wear that much empathy.
It's ironic to me because frankly,
and maybe that's not fair, but that's what I feel like I see. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it seems like it should be the opposite. It's because white people tend to not know anything about history that has to do with race, even how race was constructed, how this idea of people being different by their skin tone, it's really a social construction. It's not a biological reality. And no, people don't know that. People don't know about Emmett Till. I had one of my writer friends just posted this beautiful blog post about Emmett Till. And she told us in our little writer chat group, I didn't know about Emmett Till until like 2 years ago. I'm so embarrassed. She's in her 50s. And I've asked so many people and they don't know. And since then I've asked some people, nobody has known who Emmett Till is, which is
I didn't until you shared it with me the other day.
And I probably didn't until I worked with a history teacher who was teaching some real history.
I'll get the blog post link from you and we'll share her work in the show notes as well. I think that's just it. You would think that this is such an obvious place where there's just a lack of understanding and just be willing to step into that and say, I honestly have no idea what I don't know. So why on earth would I ever judge your pain?
Yeah.
But for some reason, I don't know why. I imagine, again, that's systemic. I think white people's response to this stuff is as systemic as the racism that causes the challenges. To begin with,
it's a good insight, for sure.
Well, again, and also it's not to let anybody off the hook, but it's just to acknowledge that we are being worked on all the time. So maybe shut off some of the external influence and just get into your head and get into your heart and spend a little time learning about some things and, and maybe it won't shift anything. And the whole thing is the audience that you and I are talking to are the people that care. The people that don't want to be a part of the discussion or the solution or whatever, everyone gets to make their choice about that. But I believe in my heart that there are a lot of people like me who really care about people. Like I care deeply about people. And yet I find myself in a place, not just geographically, but in a period of time. I think there's something about the time that we are living in right now where I'm not sure how to move forward with those feelings in a way that's safe for me, for my family. Cancel culture is scary. It's not just like it comes out of the online world and into real life for people. Yeah. And so I've seen it happen to people I love, and it scares me.
Yeah.
So I think, again, it's like trying to figure out how to navigate that. And there's a lot of discomfort that comes with the whole thing.
Yeah. I think a big challenge for people in rural communities is that there often just aren't very many people of color around.
Absolutely.
So you can have conversations, just thinking back to doing this work offline. I think I've had some great conversations with my family over the years, and they're in-person conversations, and they're in the context of loving relationships. And
that's one of my favorite lines that you also said from our earlier conversation is that this work and these conversations take place in the context of a loving relationship.
Yeah, that's really important. But at the same time, it's important to listen to the experiences of Black people and of people of color. And when we don't have them around in our small towns, that can be a challenge, right? If we do this work offline, but we don't have those voices necessarily. So I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer for that. That's a challenge, I think, a real challenge, right? Mm-hmm. Because so much of my own education, like I said before, came from being in relationship with people of color through my work and my colleagues and, that guy I dated and just different things like that. And I was really lucky. Looking back, I was really lucky for that. And so, I don't have the answer there,
Oh, I know that's really hard. But I think, when I think about what I want for small towns, what I hope for small towns is that people like you that have lived other places. And of course, first and foremost, just that people of color would feel welcome to move to our communities. Like that's first and foremost, just the thing. But that people like you that have gone to large cities or have gained experience can come back and help all of us understand that I don't ever want to make it seem like the mantle of responsibility belongs somewhere else other than ourselves. But again, I'm thinking about this from like the macro view of a community. And I want people like you to come back to communities like mine. And I had asked you before, like, has that in itself been challenging for you? Like, was the culture shock maybe not so much there when you left, but did you experience it when you came back to Mitchell? Or what has that been like for you?
Yeah, I think, it's definitely a culture shock, but I don't think it has been as much around what we're talking about. I think it's more of like just what it's like the day-to-day realities of living in a city versus small town politics and fewer options and things like that. I think if I had been doing the racial justice work up until the time we moved and then moved back, I think that it would have been different. But I was already an at-home parent and doing freelance writing for several years already in the Twin Cities before we moved back. And so, yeah. And I've seen the growth in my family over the years. I remember talking to them about some of this stuff when I was first learning it, when I would come back from Los Angeles and I was like, call them out if they use the wrong term or this or that. And the energy I had around that and how those were largely very unproductive conversations, to like having more humility with them, to listening to them more, to their perspectives and their ideas, to not being triggered by the language that they use if they use the wrong, to just like taking a breath, and not jumping down their throats for using the wrong words, but sharing like what I've seen. I've just seen a lot of openness with my own family. I have 2 brothers who live in town, younger brothers, and my parents, my grandmother live around here. And I have seen so much growth there. Not that there was tons of growth. I don't want to paint my family in a certain way, but they didn't know, it was ignorance, really. It was just ignorance. And so how some of the ideas that they held, how that's rooted in racism and that's rooted in a racist history and some of the language. And yeah, so that's been really cool.
It is really cool. And I think, so there's another word that we've used a couple times, and I think that there's a negative connotation that's attached to that as well. But the word ignorance.
Yeah.
Doesn't actually mean
dumb.
I'm dumb, correct, or backwoods. I hate that rural America is painted with that broad brush.
Girl,
it really bothers me.
It really bothers me because we know these are like some of the best people, like farmers. My dad always talks about like how he feels like there's a stereotype of dumb farmers when really farmers are like some of the smartest people out there. Generally speaking, they are like amazing. They're so innovative, resourceful, know.
Right.
I hate that too.
Right. And I'm only even calling it out just because I hear it and I see how I've seen people that aren't from here or don't understand or are part of, I don't want to even call it a side, but just part of that cancel culture mentality where they call us ignorant and they're using it as a weapon, right?
Yeah.
That it's something, and it's not, ignorance isn't stupidity. Ignorance is simply not knowing.
Correct.
That's all it is. And that's, so when we're talking about like, who's going to hear this and who's going to benefit from this, it's people, I feel like me, that might be ignorant, but want to get better.
Yeah. And are not dumb. And are far from dumb.
I don't feel stupid. I feel ignorant to certain things. And I don't, those are not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so cool. When I asked you, in our conversation before, like, what do you attribute to kind of your approach softening? Your passion and your compassion, both still being as strong as they ever were, right? But that your approach has softened and you just like attributed it to maturity and life, right? Like, there is something about becoming a parent that just like unlocks a whole flood of empathy, I think, generally. And again, that's a super stereotype. I know that doesn't happen to everybody, but I know for me, it's like anytime somebody really frustrates you, like if you can just take it right to its core and be like, well, that's somebody's kid. and just get us down back to like the brass tacks of the fact that we are all humans.
Yeah.
Trying to figure stuff out. But
realizing that a lot of what I was trying to do when I look back was trying to, I was in my 20s when I was talking like that, when I was in Los Angeles. I'm in my early 20s. And so I was trying to find my way in the world, right? And being able to be right about something and have someone else be wrong felt good to my ego. That I can see it for what it was back then. It was me trying to feel like I had an identity and I was, maybe a level above, right?
Yeah, enlightened or woke in some way that,
Yeah, for sure. And that's just not helpful. That's not helpful, and it's not kind. Yeah, it's not helpful. It doesn't further the work really, because people just put their walls up then and they're just like, well, I don't want to. Whereas if you approach things from nobody's perfect, but like this is some real history. Like this is a conversation I had one time with a Black friend, and you humanize it, then people, and a lot of times too, I've learned that you plant seeds in conversations. You're usually never going to like change someone's mind in the moment. This is something I've learned over the years, but you plant seeds. It's all about planting seeds. So you don't have to change someone's mind right when you're talking, right? But you can be soft-hearted and you can be calm with your energy, and you can be loving, and you can still be firm in your convictions. And that plants seeds. And you just don't know how those seeds are going to grow and how people are going to change.
And the other thing with that, I think, for those of us that like want to be forces for good in the world, like I truly believe that you're one of those people. And I'm so happy to be talking with you about this. I felt safe the second you and I started talking, that I could say the things that I'm not 100% sure. Like you and I, this isn't a scripted conversation. I was certain going into this today that I was going to maybe say some things that weren't quite right, but I just knew that you'd hold all of that with me. But I think the biggest thing is for those of us that want a better world, just people getting along with other people and being more compassionate and open, you can't ever change someone's mind if you refuse to step into a relationship with them. So that's another part of it, right? Like this idea of changing people's minds, you don't do it if you're not actually engaged with them. And my goal isn't to change everybody's mind. I just think it's about compassion. It's about empathy. It's about perspective gaining. And I can't do that if I only surround myself with people that think and move and act and view the world exactly the same way as I do. That's not how that happens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So your family, your community, they're very fortunate to have you with that construct. Like you put a construction on this where you calm and loving energy is something to be proud of, I think.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It makes me feel though sometimes like I don't, like kind of like you were saying before, like I don't belong anywhere, because I'm not social justice warrior-y enough for my friends who are more and that. I'm not, I have these ideas that seem kind of leftist to other people in my life who have more conservative political views. And so it's kind of a lonely road, but I think we need more people on it.
Well, and I think I question if there's maybe not a ton of us on it, but we just don't know it because we're not having those there's not anywhere for that dialogue to land, That's what I'm hoping this unlocks. And again, it doesn't have to unlock it in any major way. Like this is internal work with yourself first, then with your family, then start to move out as much as it feels comfortable. But like this is stuff that happens with the people we know and love. You don't have to try and like turn the tide out in the bigger, wider world, at least not right away,
Yeah.
So let's pivot into that. Like, what are some ideas that you might have for my small town friends that are all listening to this? And I hope it's unlocking stuff for people, because I know our first conversation certainly did for me. So what ideas do you have? Things that we can do?
Okay. So I feel like I kind of already told, like, I feel like I kind of went there already.
That's okay.
I don't really have anything super more specific.
We'll recap it then. We'll recap it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. So what can we, especially if especially if we find ourselves in a community that's fairly lacking in diversity. So it's not like we can just go to our neighbor and that we know and say, our neighbor who's a person of color, if that doesn't exist, how do we begin to better understand systemic racism in our country?
Yeah. I'll tell you what I think.
Yeah,
I don't
please
know
do.
the answers, but
Please do.
I'll tell you what I think. I think we need to remember that when people are telling us they've experienced pain, and I don't mean politicians, because I think a lot of this stuff has been co-opted by politicians. I mean, people, human beings tell us they've experienced pain or hardship. I think we need to believe them. And I think along with that, we need to learn some history. I hesitate to say Black history because it's really all of our history, but we need to learn, we need to know who Emmett Till is. We need to understand some of this systemic stuff. And that's just reading. There's plenty of books out there. You can even, this isn't something I've done, but it's something I like to do. I saw a friend was posting about wanting to read Black fiction. So wanting to read fiction by Black authors, which I think is so brilliant, because when you read, a fictional story that someone wrote, you're getting a peek into the way they see the world. Because I'm not a fiction writer myself. I write nonfiction, but when, fiction writers draw from their life and their worldview, right? And so reading fiction even by Black authors is going to help widen your perspective of how people experience the world. So I think, being open to the idea that there is systemic racism and that there is a lot to learn there, I think is just a huge, huge thing. So maybe we can link to some things, maybe after the show we can talk about and link to some that where people could start. There's a lot out there and it depends, but there's a lot out there. I think that's, we need to believe that there is such a thing as systemic racism that comes from history, that comes from the way we're socialized. We have to be open to that. And we need to believe people when they say that has caused them pain.
Right.
So I think that's a good starting point.
Right.
Just along with that, just thinking back to the story that I shared, that's something I experienced just a month ago. Even with all the work I've done, I still had an experience where a Black woman said she was really hurt by something that I did and that it felt racial to her. And we have to have the humility to keep learning, even when we've started learning. We have to keep learning and keep listening. Try to set down the defensiveness, right? And try to we have to keep doing it. It's work that doesn't stop, I don't think, I've learned. And then I think just the last thing is what we were talking about a lot, which is doing this work off of the internet, doing it in your own heart, your own mind, and with people in your actual life.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most important things. I want to tell you, I think it's such a great list, by the way. And I think it's stuff that feels, for the people that want to step into this, it's going to feel manageable and doable. Yeah. Because it can all feel very despairing. I think if you spend way too much time, looking at the internet, it can feel like, well, what can I possibly do? So there's this simple list. This last weekend, my husband and I actually engaged him in a pretty lengthy conversation. And it's interesting. He has some different perspectives on all of this because he was in the military. So he engaged with plenty of people of color, right? So we had a beautiful conversation, and we ended up experiencing, and I don't want to in any way allude to where I was or where this happened at all, but we were in the region of our small community, right, in North Dakota. And this gentleman had come up to us while we were talking. He doesn't know either of us very well. And it was kind of small talk, which right now small talk completely centers on coronavirus and or the racial tension happening, right? And understandably so, like they're very big things. But as soon as this gentleman started talking, I became acutely aware that I was not going to hold many of the same viewpoints that he did. And I got supremely uncomfortable, to the point that as he kept talking, he actually used the N-word several times in the conversation.
He did?
He did. Yeah. Just blatantly. Like it was, and I have not experienced that. Gosh, I'm not even sure when the last time would have been that I heard just a person like can I just interject that? Yeah,
I was just talking with my neighbor and a friend last night, and they were saying the same thing. Like she was telling me that her grandfather and one of her uncles, they use that word. I was like, that's not my experience. So just to echo, that's not my experience at all. Like I've never heard that word outside of like hip hop. So that's really interesting. It's really, I felt confronted in that moment. I did not say anything. Okay. I will say that I absolutely wussed out completely because I wasn't actually, he was just kind of talking directly to my husband. Okay.
As soon as he started down that path, I literally looked down into my French fries and just like kept my head down. I couldn't even look at him. And I just felt like a ball, like the size of an orange, like in my throat. And I was just like, and I almost felt like I was going to have a small panic attack. My husband could very clearly pick up on it. Like, and he just did what he could to rush it along. And we get in the car and I was just like, I said, see, that is my fear, is that that's what people that don't know us assume we all think and act like in rural America. And it was just and I mean, the fact that it happened the day after I talked to you, I was just like, well, I mean, obviously. So, and then again, to your original point, that is what people assume racism is. And it is, that is racism. Yes, 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 and yes. But that's not even what we're talking about.
Right.
That's not just ignorance. That's worse than ignorance. And it was, oh my gosh, I thought about how it made me feel. And I'm like, it's not even derogatory to me. Like that wasn't, God, it was so painful. And I just thought, well, it's reinforcing to me that this is a conversation that needs to take place. And I certainly didn't want to end our conversation on that, but I think it just shows that, like, and I would say unequivocally, I've been living back home for 11 years now. I haven't seen or heard that. So it was a very small, isolated thing. That is not how small towns in rural America feels. And for everybody listening, I hope that they can take some of the ideas that you shared, the stories that you shared. Thank you so much for opening yourself up to this. But I just think when people are hurting, no matter who they are, as humans, like, the least we can do is show concern and care for that pain. And I understand that that's going to look different for every single one of us, but I feel blessed that you and I have connected on this level, and I'm going to already have started taking the steps of some of the things that we're talking about. And I just think the internet is trying to paint a story. It's trying to paint a narrative for all of us. And I don't know that that's, like you said, that's not where the work has to take place.
Yeah.
So
I have one more story.
Please. Yes, please do.
That I didn't share about my work that I thought of back in St. Paul. And I think it's really powerful. So this is, again, another moment that stands out among so many moments at this school. We had this student who was biracial, I think half Black, half Latina, if I remember right, or something along those lines. And she was really hard. She was really strong-willed. She had a lot of pain in her life. She was hard. And one of the things we could do in our classroom, because there were two of us, is we could pull students out into the hallway and have conversations while the other one could stay in, which was so powerful. So this is a student who would storm out of class sometimes. I mean, she had a lot of anger, and she was actually in my homeroom. We had these kind of small groups where we got to know a small group of students intimately, She had said multiple times, had told our social worker that we're racist, that Kelly and I are my co-teacher and I, and maybe other teachers too, were racist. And I remember feeling so damn defensive about that because, sorry to swear, but
you're fine.
I'm like, here I am literally living and breathing anti-racist work, like so obsessed with trying to solve this. And so it would just I just found her so difficult because she was telling another colleague who was then talking, she feels like some things that you guys do and say are racist. And I was just like, really? Literally all we're trying to do is be anti-racist, right? So it really touched this nerve, And I remember one day, I might cry, to be honest.
That's okay.
One day in the hallway, we had a conversation, and I was like, what if I try just softening and just hearing her and just softening my approach with her? Not that I had been harsh with her, but just being open to the idea that I'm racist. Okay. What if I just try that? I don't know, trying to figure out how I can connect with her.
Right.
And I just softened toward her. And I said to her, I'm not going to say her name, so I don't want to say her name, but I said, listen, I'm white. I get it. I'm white. I'm trying to hear what you're saying. I just said something like that to her. And I remember when I said I'm white, and then I said, I'm not going to get it. I'm trying to get it. When I said just a couple of sentences like that, her demeanor just completely shifted. And our relationship was never the same after that conversation. She was completely different. It's I was just open to validating that she was saying, I'm in pain. I'm in pain and this doesn't feel comfortable, and so I don't know if she was saying she really felt like we were doing things that felt overtly racist, or if she just needed someone to validate her pain.
Yeah.
And when I just said that to her, those couple of sentences in the hallway, truly our relationship was different for the rest of the year. Our dynamic was different. She trusted me. She was open with me, because I had humility to just say in the moment, like, I'm white. I'm not going to understand some of this stuff. You're going to need to help me. You're going to need to help me. And I'm listening to what you have to say. It was just a total shift.
Yeah. And I think that is so important. And, one of the things I had said in the Facebook group that I remember you and I talked about is being able to put your ego aside and put humility on doesn't mean that you're ashamed of being white. That's not the call. That's not what you're advocating for us to do, is to be ashamed of our whiteness. Like, what good does that do? But it's about putting our ego aside that we know so damn much when we maybe don't.
Yes, I like the way you said that.
It's just, that's not the same. You don't have to be guilty or ashamed of your color. Like, that's not, but
that's not helpful.
No, it's not. And I don't think deep down, sometimes, there might be a moment of satisfaction. Like, well, you should be ashamed. I don't know. Maybe there's a tiny bit of that, but that isn't actually helpful long-term. It's not productive. And I think, like you had said, when you were younger and you'd approach all of this with that anger, the goal is being productive in the sense that the goal is to move this forward, to move all of us forward. And so if putting your ego aside can help create productive conversation, it's so worth doing. Yeah. And what an important moment of connection for her.
Oh, yes. And a moment of humility for me to just say, if someone's in pain, who am I to be like, I really don't think I am being racist. I really feel like I'm trying hard over here. Why? Why do I have to do that? Why does that have to be the posture? Why can't I just say, I acknowledge that I'm not a person of color. I acknowledge that, and I'm listening to what you have to say. I didn't even change anything I did in the classroom with her, right? I just had this moment where I was like, I am listening and I hear you say that you are in pain. And I hear you. It was validating. And it was just so powerful. And I think, I just think that comes back to that humility. Just have to have that humility.
Yeah. And this,
that you just might not know.
Yeah.
You might not know.
You might not know. And I think, again, this is instructive for all relationships. Every context, every topic, it just doesn't matter. Like, if we find ourselves being dismissive of someone else's experience, it kills connection for sure. And the
truth is, we can't know how anyone else is walking through the world. Even
at all.
People who look just like us. Everyone is living a totally different story. But there's a whole reality around race in this country that we definitely don't know how people of color are walking through the world. We definitely don't know that. We don't even know how people next to us are walking through the world. So I think humility is an important posture for sure.
Well, and I think being open to having this conversation is a great place to start. And I just seriously, I can't thank you enough. I know that it's a really big topic. It's really charged, especially right now. And this was your very first podcast episode. So thank you for just jumping into the deep end with me. But
I'm trying to be more, it was like my New Year's resolution. I'm trying to be brave, and talk about what's on my heart, because I think we have to have dialogue with each other about things. We have to be able to talk for things to change. We have to be able to say what we think and say, I might not know everything, but here's where I'm coming from. And we have to have other people hear us and let us know where they're coming from. And otherwise, the world's going to devolve.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I think this gives everybody listening a beautiful place to start.
Well, so thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Now I'm going to be addicted to being on podcasts. Having good conversation is one of my favorite things to do in the world. And that's basically all we did. So
me too, sister. So thank you so much. And we'll talk with you soon.
Sounds good. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Small Town Big Talk Show. If you enjoyed today's show, we invite you to subscribe on Stitcher, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And we'd love for you to leave us a 5-star review. The more reviews we get, the easier it will be for other small town friends to find us. We encourage you to keep on living big in your small town because the size of your life is not determined by your zip code.